the Infinite Spark of Being podcast. My name is Keith Welsh, and in this episode, we're going to talk about grief and loss. In all of the sessions I've done with people over the years, which is hundreds, second to combat veterans is grief and loss. And even the combat veterans are mostly dealing with grief and loss. And at least that's what it ends up coming down to. And it's something that permeates the human experience. Everyone deals with the mortality of themselves, the mortality of others. You know, it's the old age, sickness, death thing, that's, you know, the human experience. So over the years, I've come to an understanding of grief and loss, what I believe it is, and putting that into practice with other people, we've been able to move them through this process and of kind of grieving and coming to terms with the loss of something that was perceivably always going to be there. And I believe I've come to a unique understanding of it, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. But before we get into all of that, if you enjoy the subject matter of these podcasts, then you would definitely enjoy any of the 3 Patreon discussion groups that are available. You can read about these groups by going to theinfinitesparkofbeing.com and clicking the Patreon/donate button. This is a community of everyday people who are interested in living with a deeper understanding of spiritual practice and how it can be applied in a practical sense to our everyday lives. Join us. So, grief and loss, you meet people that they've struggled for years with depression and anxiety and addiction. And oftentimes at the root of it, you can find some grief and some loss. And in order to understand that to be a confusion in the mind, we need to understand a few things first. And some of this, if you've given this podcast any time, you've heard this before, but the mind uses symbols. And everything is a symbol to the mind, and it uses these symbols to tell the body how to feel, how to react, what chemicals it's going to need. And this is the biological, physiological, root chakra, earth mode, whatever you want to call it, component to this. And in this podcast, with everything that I do, I try to bring the material and the spiritual together so that we can understand it, because ultimately they both coexist. You know, a lot of the spiritual pursuit is to escape the material world, but the material world is a reflection of soul and consciousness and all of these things. And when we lean too far into the spiritual, we neglect the material. When we lean too far into the material, we neglect the spiritual. And both lead to confusion. People think that if they go really hard in the paint on spirituality and religion or whatever, that they escape the problems of the material world, but you don't. And the spiritual kind of helps us understand the material. So the mind uses symbols to tell the body how to feel, what to do, etc. And everything becomes a symbol, whether it's smells, obviously, sounds, things like that, but people become symbols. And the mind will perceive the human being as the source of love, romance, safety, etc. Think about that. If I were to walk past your primary caregiver, your mother or your father, whoever, in a grocery store, your children, whoever, and I see them, I feel nothing because I don't know them. My mind has no association. Even if you said, hey, that's my mom, it wouldn't be like, oh my God, suddenly I feel everything you feel. That's not the case. But if I see my mother, right, it's different. You know, if I see, and granted, there's little thought exercises over the years that I've mentioned where you look upon someone and say, oh, this is the center of somebody's universe, this is the love of someone's life, this is whatever. But it still doesn't measure to what you feel when you perceive this person. Remember, perception means the way we regard, understand, and interpret something. So the way we regard, understand, and interpret these individuals is unique to us. We've all been in love several occasions in our lives, right? And all of those loves were different, right? The love you feel for the person that you decide to spend the rest of your life with is much different than the love you felt for flings or people you just dated for a year or so, or whatever it is. It's different. It's all different all the time. So if the mind is using symbols to tell the body how to feel about something, it's doing it because it needs an object, right? Granted, smells aren't objects, but bear with me. The object of mom, dad, whoever, that object, that person, that meat body, that whatever you want to call it, mammalian bipedal hominid, is telling the mind to feel, or telling the mind to inform the body to feel love, to feel safety, to feel whatever it is, right? When the mind no longer has access to the form, there is a confusion. We see that in like jobs, for instance. When somebody retires after, say, they've spent 30 or 40 years doing the same thing, they retire and they have no idea who they are. Some of you listening to this have experienced that. Some of you have noticed that with your parents, your grandparents. They'll retire and it's kind of like they get a little lost. Sometimes, not all the time. My father was not lost. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. And someone like my mother, she never did retire. She always went to work, whether it was one day a week or whatever it was. But that's ego, right? The ego knows who, it tells us who we are, and there's value in that, and all that kind of thing. Self-concept plays into that. So we look upon other people and we feel a thing. It's so a love, a romantic relationship, same thing. You know, when there's a breakup and we are no longer, connected romantically to this person, that's grief and loss, right? When it comes to the death of a loved one, if I were to ask you, right, my most recent was my mother, like 4 years ago. My dad died. I was looking the other day, we just moved. That's why if you're watching on YouTube, that load of things is still in the car because there were so many boxes in the house. I still didn't have the heart to bring this stuff inside. As things are getting packed away, I'm like, all right, we're gonna have to unload the car. If I were to ask you, do mommies die, right? Do daddies die? Do children die? Do people die? Do dogs die? You'd say, yes, of course they do. They have to. It's the circle of life, or whatever thing you'd say. But back to what I was saying, I was looking through some papers and I saw my dad's death certificate. I was like, oh, he was 71. I thought he was 70. He was 71, which means I was 31. 31. He was, my parents were 40 when they had me, so I was 31. And so that means like 16 years ago. My mom was 4 years ago. And we like to say that with time, wounds are healed. Time heals all wounds. That's not necessarily the case. But if I were to ask you, hey, do these people die? You would say, yes, of course they do. Then if you know that, and you would say, well, of course, everybody dies, then what's the problem? Well, it's because on one hand, we know that. On the other hand, there is this attachment to love and affection and motherhood, fatherhood, to be somebody's son. And when that goes away, the mind doesn't know where to plug back in. Okay? It's not that, yes, we miss them, but it's like I'll give you my own experience. So even after my dad died, there was a reason I was telling you that he was 71. I still was somebody's son, right? I still had a relationship. That identity still was, identity is relational. So my identity was still as son-ness. There was still that connection to parents, because my mother was still alive, right? So when I say there's layers to grief and loss, this is what I mean. So father dies, and this is just my relationship with my father. Maybe your relationship with your father is different, but just, put it into whatever, formula you need to understand it in. But I don't think it hurt as bad because I still had, that thing. I was also probably closer to my mother than I was my father. I loved both, but, we all have different relationships with our parents. And then when my mom died, suddenly I was no longer somebody's son. So think once my dad dies, I now have, the ego has more value because now it, because remember, ego is personal importance, personal identity. So the value kind of goes up a little bit because now you are, I became the only other, the man in my mom's life. I was taking care of things, So that's getting fulfilled, and I'm still somebody's son. I'm still important to somebody. Then when my mom passed, dropped her body, my mind didn't see that it was now there's nowhere to plug it in. And the way I think about it is those old movies where there's a switchboard and an operator, for the phones, right? And she patches the cords and goes, okay, you want to talk to this person, they'll plug in here, you want to So I was unplugged from that kind of love, that kind of value, that kind of identity was completely unplugged. So now that love is gone, perceivably. My son-ness, my caregiver-ness, my importance is all gone. Now, that's on a subconscious level. Consciously, if you're well, you think you don't have value? Yeah, I still have value. But it's different, right? And that's where the grief comes in. The grief comes in where you no longer believe, or the mind doesn't perceive that love as being something that's accessible. So put that off to the side. There's that factor. Remember I said there's layers and components and factors. So there's those things at play. Then there's also, if I ask you, what was the best part about your mother, father, or loved ones? The best thing, the first thing that comes to mind when I think of my mother isn't her corporeal body, or the best part of my dad wasn't his corporeal form. It was something else. It was this love. It was this you try to put words to it. You try to pin it down, but you can't. You can't pin it down. But I can tell you this, the best part about my mother or father or grandparents wasn't their body. It was something else. If you believe that you would benefit from working with me one-on-one on grief and loss, anxiety, ruminating thinking, then shoot me an email or direct message. Or if you're interested in learning about meditation and how it can transform your reality and in turn change your life, then again, please reach out through email or direct message. Thank you. That's the real thing. The body comes, the body goes, the body changes, right? But there's that thing that we need to plug back into. And that's the work I've done with people over the years, is plugging them back into that real love. And once the mind is now connected to that real love, does that mean there's no longer any tears? No, it doesn't. In fact, recently moving, there's been a lot of tears, but it's not that sadness. It's, in Buddhism, I've heard teachers say that, that there's certain tears that we cry that they're like the real tears, and the rest of it's piss. That it's something else. But they're not happy tears necessarily. They're just tears. They're tears for the sake of tears. And it's not even sadness, I would say. It's just, we try to define it, and we'll want to call it sadness because there's tears involved. But think about it. You're not always sad when you cry. Even when it's I won't even say that I've missed my mom and dad. But there's this feeling like, man, I wish you could see this. But then there's a piece of me that, due to probably brainwashing and thought exercises and spiritual practice, you can call it whatever you want, brainwashing or spiritual practice. Then there's this knowing. Well, they do know. They're here. And I get little signs. We get little signs from my girlfriend, her mother's dropped her body as well. But we get signs. Do another episode on that sometime. But once you start to pay attention, you find signs. Synchronicities. Little hellos, as my cousin Carrie calls them. You get little hellos. So, but there's still this teary-eyed thing. A gentleman sent me a very nice message on Facebook the other day. And he was an ex-client, and it brought me to tears. I know he listens to the podcast because he mentioned it. He's probably listening to this, and it brought me to tears, man. And not just a little misty thing, but like a cry. Was I sad? No. Was I happy? I'm not overwhelmingly beaming for joy. I mean, yeah, I'm glad that he's doing well, right? I'm glad you're doing great, man. But I'm sorry. There's a motorcycle in front of me, so I'm gonna let him get ahead of me for a bit. The loud pipes thing. But we'll do an episode on identity sometime. But this, there's tears, but it's not sadness. It's not overwhelmingly beaming with joy. There's tears, real tears. And to know that I'm helping, to know that I'm making some sort of a difference, there's tears. And so when we begin to move through grief and loss, we experience these tears, but they're not the longing, painful, guttural sadness that we felt. So I don't tend to call it grief. Like I said, grief is a confusion. Loss is a confusion. I have a tattoo on my wrist that says no loss, only change. Some of you have been following this long enough have seen that on things. Especially if you've been following since the Tumblr days. So that's it. The mind, because remember, the mind believes that everything is fixed and solid in time forever and ever, and it'll never change. And then there's change, and then there's suffering, and there's discontentment, there's all that stuff, right? The first noble truth, life is fundamentally unsatisfying. Why is it fundamentally unsatisfying? Because the mind constantly grasps and clings. The grasping and clinging is the root of the suffering, the dissatisfaction. Then we get to the third noble truth. You don't grasp and cling, the mind does. You're not the mind. We can direct the mind, we can sit with the mind, we can teach the mind, we can train the mind. But the pain from grief and loss does not have to be there. You do not have to live like that. You do not have to. You do not have to live in this place of pain and suffering. Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. Things are going to hurt. With a little help, some skillfulness, we can move through that. Sometimes I look at my mother and father's wedding picture and I get a little misty-eyed. Does that mean I'm longing for them to be here? No, because to be honest with you, if, here's the thing, right? So my mother passed right at the start of the lockdowns and the pandemic and COVID. My mother would have been locked away and isolated. Had my mother lived from the things she went through, she would have had to go into assisted living. If you'd known my mother, God help everyone trying to serve her. The best thing that could have happened to my mother is that she dropped her body. Death is easy for the ones that die. It's only difficult for us. So, depending on what you believe, if it is an eternal dirt nap and you just turn off and go blank and that's it and you no longer exist, you won't care. The death is difficult for the people around you, the people that love you, because of attachment through the mind and the grasping and clinging of the mind. So illusion is anything that is or is likely to be wrongly perceived by the senses. And perception means to regard, understand, and interpret. So my perception was that my mother was gone. I have access to the love of my mother all the time. This is what I do with people, is try to reconnect them. Not try, but do. You just unplug it and plug it back into the love of that person. So back to what I was about to say to finish my thought. After my mother died, I was in a restaurant and I was watching this man walk his elderly mother through the restaurant. There's so much love there, but I felt bad for him because I know what he's going through. To care for your elderly mother is difficult. To care for your elderly anything is difficult. To care for your elderly dog is difficult, right? If my mom was here, would I do it? Absolutely. But is she free of suffering and pain? Absolutely. And that's what I prefer. Because getting old is difficult. Things stop working well. And when you're caring for somebody like that, you get lost in the sauce, as they say. You're just kind of like in it, just kind of swimming in it. It's all very difficult. And that's the thing. Can it be, like, it was that thing that I'd written about it and told you about before, where my dad was in the next room dying. I'm in the kitchen with my mother, and I said, once he passes on, you'll be able to heal, and da da da. And she said, I would take care of him in that state. I would take care of him in that state for the rest of my life because that's my guy. There's that, and she doesn't want him to suffer. And death is the release of all of the pain and suffering. So I say this has got layers to it. When we feel choked up by these things, it's not a longing. The pain of grief initially is the longing. It's but you were right here a minute ago, and now you're gone? I sat with my mom's body and I sat with my dad's body. I spent time with their body. And that's something that is missing in our culture. Is that we used to spend time with the body. We would dress it, clean it. Now it's just, we don't see it. We have no connection to it. And I believe that when we get to spend a little time, it allows things to kind of settle for the mind to come to terms with what's going on. Like I first held my mom's hand when she had passed. It was warm still. And you're staring at me like, are they going to wake up? It's like if you've ever had your dog put to sleep. It's like, they always say that the worst part about putting your pet to sleep is that they never look dead. Humans look dead. When a human's dead, it's like, oh, this is definitely a thing. A dog, it's like, are you sleeping? Like staring at their chest, like, did I just see it move? But I held my mother's hand until I could feel it start to get cold. I held my dad's hand until I felt it start to get cold. And then you let go physically. And it's like, the thought came to mind. It was like, I will never lay eyes on you again. I will never look at you again. That's very difficult. Because the hardest thing for me, whether it was one of my dogs or my parents, it's like you have to leave the room. And that's the hardest part, is leaving the room. It's leaving the room is difficult. But you do it. You leave the room. And I always felt like there was like a rubber band attached to me. You kind of got to get out of the parking lot or it has to snap eventually. It has to come undone because you have to move on. My mom used to say, I miss your father's mind the most. That's what she would say. I miss his mind because he always knew what to do. And my mom, after my dad died, my mom was living on 7 acres in the middle of nowhere in this giant house by herself. My aunt moved in with her, but, between you and me, my aunt was about as useless as a bull with tits, as my father used to say. She was more of a pain in the ass than anything. Janet, I may have mentioned her. She's the one that went in my mother's hospital room and tried to talk her into going towards the light when my mother wasn't quite close to death. Go into the light. Mom's like, Janet, what the fuck? So, my mom missed that aspect of my dad. And I understand that. I remember when I bought, not this house but the one before, after my mom died. It was weird to do it on my own. It's a very lonely process, purchasing a home by yourself. It was lonely for me anyway. It wasn't that I wanted advice from anybody or anything like that. It was just lonely. And I remember moving into the house and hanging up my parents' wedding picture. It's a great picture. Maybe I'll post it in my Instagram feed. But it's a really good picture. My dad they're driving away in this really old car. And it's in the 60s. And my dad's clearly intoxicated, driving a death machine. But they're very happy. And, I remember hanging it up and thinking, man, I wish you were here. That was the thought. And then another thought was, why? Why do you wish they were here? And then I had the funny thought. I was like, I've never taken your advice. I wouldn't start now. And then I just kind of chuckled and was like, yeah. I know for a fact my parents would be very proud of me right now. They would. They'd laugh, because there's some stuff to laugh at. Because we had kind of that weird sense of humor where we laughed at difficult things. But yeah. So we can reconnect to the love that was there. Because the thing that made these people so special to us had nothing to do with their body. Is there a piece of it, hugs, love, things that, yeah, there is. I'm not gonna deny that. But the real essence is something we do still have access to. We can connect back to it. It can be in our lives. Does that mean we don't shed a tear? We don't feel that sometimes? Yeah. But we got to be careful how we describe it to ourselves. So that's where we're at. I love you. I love you. I love you. This was good. It's good for me to talk about it sometimes. Okay. Bye-bye. If you enjoy this content and you would like to support the creation of more of this content, go to the website theinfinitesparkofbeing.com and explore the many ways to do that. Also, click the About button, read a little bit about me, and see what I have to offer you. And don't forget to check out the Patreon tiers if you'd like to join a spiritual community of everyday people with not so everyday interests. Go ahead and check out the Patreon/donate button on the website.